Well, thanks very much, everybody. When Ken rang me up and told me that you were from the League of Rights, my initial reaction was, well, look, I've been called all sorts of things. I'm in the pay of the coal industry, I'm in the pay of the oil industry, I'm a tobacco industry denier, all these terrible things. And, you know, you don't want to believe everything that you hear about organisations of people. And essentially my attitude is that I will talk to anybody who invites me, whether it's a mob of crazy green people or a group of farmers, you name it. I'm very happy to talk. Because it's so important that we have this freedom of speech, that we can talk to people, and that we also respect other people and don't just naturally put them into some category of a bunch of lunatics or whatever, which has happened to me. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the Great Barrier Reef, and of course you've all been told that the reef is in a very, very bad state. There's a big government report that just came out just the other day that said the reef is in very poor state. Now, what I want to do is first to give you a little bit of a geography lesson for the southerners and foreigners amongst us, that this is the Great Barrier Reef out here. It's a long way from the shore. The coast is obviously here, 3,000 kilometres long, and this is very important that we remember that it's actually quite a long way from shore. I'll show you what you mean by that in a minute, but there you have it. It's a great big system. And it's on its last legs, supposedly. It's been killed not just by climate change, which is the one that most people have heard of, but up in North Queensland we're also told it's been killed by sediment, which is mud from agriculture, nutrients, which is fertiliser, pesticides, dredging, overfishing, sunscreen, medical drugs, coal dust, even land-derived fungal dusts are killing the Great Barrier Reef. But the question is, how sure are we of the reliability of some of this science? And are the methods which make science reliable actually being used in this Great Barrier Reef science? I'm going to show you some areas of the science or the evidence which is demonstrably wrong, and also going to look at other areas of science where there are problems with the quality checking. So let's get straight into it. What makes science really reliable? Okay, now I'm a physicist originally, although I've worked on the Great Barrier Reef for most of my life. And of course one of the most important parts of physics is the Newton's laws of motions. Now these are utterly reliable to 7 or 8 significant figures, and we rely on them every day. They tell us how a car goes around a bend, how an aeroplane flies. They're literally tested billions of times a day. Same with the laws of quantum mechanics, tell us how the computer works. Thermodynamics tell us how the engine works. And a large fraction of medical science is massively tested, checked and replicated. And you can stake your life on them. In fact, you do stake your life on them every day. If they didn't work, the aeroplanes would be crashing all the time. Okay, but there are these systems of checking, testing and replication being used, generally speaking, in the environmental science? And that would include climate change, but all of them, in fact. And in fact, the main system of quality assurance is not this massive checking, testing and replicating. It's a thing called peer review. Now, who's heard of peer review here? Okay, well, virtually all of you. Now, most people think peer review is when a bit of work by some scientist is checked by maybe a dozen other scientists, and they pore over the data for months on end, they redo the experiments, and then at the end they pontificate and say, yes, the work was right or it was wrong. But in fact, peer review is usually a quick check, so the work is given to maybe 2 other scientists who may look at it for a couple of hours, maybe a day, but probably not. They never do the experiments, they never really have a time to go over the data again properly, and then they decide whether it's right or wrong. So it's just a quick cursory check. And what we're finding is that a lot of this peer-reviewed literature is wrong, around about half, as we're going to see in a few minutes. So this is the head of one of the medical's largest and most important journals, The Lancet, Richard Horton. This is what he says about peer review. We know that the system of peer review is biased, unjust, unaccountable, incomplete, easily fixed, often insulting, usually ignorant, occasionally foolish and frequently wrong. Right? So that is the system that's used to decide whether most science that gets into the journal is okay. And as you can see, it's a bit of a problem. So what I'm going to do is look at some of the science. We only have a time to look at just a little bit of the science and the evidence used to say that the Great Barrier Reef is a bit of a problem. I think you're going to see there's at least a prima facie case that there's a quality assurance problem. So the first one relates to the coral growth rates. So what we have here is the growth rate effectively against time from 1900 to roughly the present. This is a very famous piece of work that said the growth rate comes along and then it crashes. It started to crash at about 1990. The only problem is that it was wrong. So I employed a couple of guys for the best part of a year to re-go over the data. We found two major errors in the work, and in fact this drop in fact is an increase. By the way, the dots are the error margins associated with it. So rather than this drop, which was attributed to the carbon dioxide dissolving into the water, in fact, if anything, perhaps there is a slight increase in the coral growth rates. And in fact, other workers have found the same thing. So for example, these guys here found that the offshore coral reefs and the mid-shelf coral reefs, there's a growth rate increase of about 11%, let's say 10%, over the last 60 to 70 years. For the inshore reefs, there's possibly been a 5% decrease. But the important thing here is that, and this is a very tricky thing that the scientists often use, is that in fact these offshore reefs and mid-shelf reefs are about 99% of the coral. So for 99% of the coral, there's about a 10% increase in growth rates over the last 50 to 80 years. But for about 1%, there's been a decrease. But even with this good news story, these authors say this: our new findings nevertheless continue to raise concerns. The more pristine mid and outer shelf reefs appear to be undergoing a transition from increasing to decreasing rates of calcification. So in fact, a good news story suddenly becomes a bad news story. The farmers up north are very worried at the moment because there's new legislation that's affecting virtually everything that they do. It's been passed by the state government. And one of the things is they're saying that mud from farms is killing the reef. But in fact, this is a typical picture of the Great Barrier Reef. You can see the sand, it's white sand. And when you actually look at this sand, and we've done a lot of work on this, it's calcium carbonate. It's made from broken corals and other organisms. There is no land-derived sand on the Great Barrier Reef. You can tell by looking at the actual chemical composition. So for about 99% of the coral on the reef or on the Queensland coast, there literally is virtually no sand or mud from the coast that ever reaches there. Here's another picture. Green Island, very famous. You can see the coast. It's about 15 to 20, maybe 30 kilometres away. This is white coral sand. Where is the mud? How can the farmers be killing this reef if that's the case? Now remember, the reef is a long way from the coast, and yes, there's some big rivers, and we're going to see some pictures of the river plumes, the mud that comes out of those rivers, but in fact generally they never reach those offshore reefs. But occasionally they do, right? So this was the beginning of this year, and we can see the biggest river on the coast, the Burdekin River, and all the mud coming from the coast. And unusually, on this occasion, it just reached one of the inshore reefs, or one of these innermost of the offshore reefs, I should say. Now this went right around the world as an example of how farmers are essentially killing the reef. But in fact, it in fact proves the opposite, because what actually happens is that one or two of these reefs got a little bit of slightly muddy water. Out of the 3,000 reefs of the Great Barrier Reef, one or two got it for a couple of days, and a river plume like this may not reoccur for another 3 to 10 years, okay? And most of them don't ever go offshore. Because of the particular wind direction, this one did go offshore, but most of them hug the coast and go off to the northwest. So in fact, these pictures show the opposite, that in fact, this is a very rare event, almost never occurs, and even when it does occur, a fraction of the reef gets an insignificant amount of mud for a very short amount of time. Hardly much to worry about. Here's another picture of the mud on this reef, okay? So this is the flood water. You can see it's slightly brown, but in fact this water has got very low concentrations of mud in it. It's more like black tea, right? Black tea, you can leave it on the bench for as long as you like. There's no sediment there. It's actually long organic molecules that give it the colour. That's mostly what you're seeing here. But it turns out that some of the corals, some of the reefs on the Queensland coast are affected by sediment. These are the inshore reefs. So this is the one, I like to call it the world's dirtiest reef. It's just north of Townsville. It's probably not, there's probably dirtier ones, but it's called Paluma Shoals, and you can see it's right on the coast, and these are the inshore reefs, maybe 1% of the coral. And look at the water around it. It's brown, right? And it's brown because the mud around it, which has been there for thousands of years, is being stirred up by the waves. So the reason that it's like this is in fact due to the strong winds. So strong winds are what causes the sediment on these reefs. And it turns out that this has been going on since time immemorial. It's always been the case. So here are two pictures. This is a classic picture that's sometimes shown, showing a flood plume from 2007. You can see the dirty water close inshore. Most of the mud actually drops out close to the river mouth, but there is a little bit of murky water here. But in fact, when you do the measurements, there's virtually no sediment in it. Contrasting with this situation, where we have the same coastline, you see the muddy, this brown water here. This is during the dry season. The rivers haven't been flowing for many, many months, and that muddy water is due to the very strong wind that's blowing, resuspending the sediment that's been there for a very long time. So even those corals are not affected directly by the river plumes. It's actually the wind that causes most of the mud. All right, so of course one of the biggest things that everybody knows about is that the corals are being killed by climate change. And there's no doubt that very hot water that you occasionally get will kill a lot of coral. It goes white. That's why they call it bleaching. But there's things you should know about corals. And the first thing is that in fact corals like it hot. So this is the coral growth rate again, plotted against the sea surface temperature. And you can see that the colder water has lower growth rates than the hotter water. And if you want to find the fastest growing coral, you go to Papua New Guinea and Thailand, where you'll get the fastest growing coral. And in fact, the slow growing coral is on the southern Great Barrier Reef, or even further south in Moreton Bay. You can go to Sydney, there's corals off there, but they grow so slowly that they can't even form a reef. Corals actually like it hot. All right, but what's this bleaching though? All right, a coral is a little animal called a polyp, and inside it lives a microscopic algae called zooxanthellae, and that gives it its colour. And periodically the algae gets thrown out, which makes it go white. But in fact, there's this cooperation between the algae and the plant is an amazing thing. The zooxanthellae gives it the energy, but occasionally, for some reason, when it gets too hot, the zooxanthellae effectively becomes poisonous and it ejects it. But it's not usually a death sentence. Normally, the coral will recover after being bleached. It's a bit analogous to, and it's a safety mechanism, is actually a strategy for life. It's a little bit like some eucalyptus trees will drop their leaves in real massive water stress, okay? And they do it to survive, and they will often recover from it. Okay, so the important thing about corals is they're actually born with no zooxanthellae, and they take it from the water. They can actually take the zooxanthellae from the water. I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to skip that one too. What happens though is that they can choose the type of zooxanthellae that they take from the water. And some zooxanthellae make them very, very adaptable to hot water. They are much less likely to bleach, but they'll possibly grow a little bit more slowly. Those would be maybe the low-octane zooxanthellae. Or they can take in high-octane zooxanthellae, which will make them grow really quickly, but they are possibly more sensitive to bleaching. So if a hot weather comes along, they might be killed. So you can see that there's an evolutionary trade-off here as to what type of zooxanthellae they take. So one thing that they can do though is after being bleached, they can actually then take in a different type of zooxanthellae, which gives them the ability to be more adaptable in the future to deal with hot water. The net result of this is in fact that corals, more than almost any other animal, are able to deal with a changing climate from whatever cause, because all they have to do is change the zooxanthellae inside them and they can deal with a lot warmer or a lot colder water. Now that's not like virtually every other creature like us. We have to go through many generations and the genetics have to change, not with zooxanthellae. So I often say that bleaching is a bit like a bushfire. It looks terrible after it happens. It's entirely natural. It's not a new phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination, though scientists will often claim. And it recovers within less than a decade from these bleaching events. I want to talk a bit about crown of thorns starfish, which supposedly these plagues are a new phenomenon, and they're eating the reef. These are now blamed on the farmers. It's said that the nutrients from fertiliser are causing these plagues because it allows the larvae of the crown of thorns starfish to survive, whereas they might not have done before European settlement. But actually the link between the farmers and the crown of thorns starfish is incredibly weak, and in fact there's 100 times more cycling of nutrients across the seabed in the reef than comes out of all the rivers anyway. So the farmers are just a tiny fraction of what's going on. The other thing is that the crown of thorns starfish experts have actually said that this link with the nutrients from fertiliser is very, very weak. And we also know that these plagues have been going on for thousands of years, so why do we think that anything has changed? Right, now there are many other examples of possibly untrustworthy science. You would have heard, for example, that maybe 93% of the reef bleached, which implied that maybe 93% actually was killed. Well, actually, on the Great Barrier Reef during the big 2016 event, maybe only 8% of the coral actually was killed, right? Now that sounds like a lot of coral, doesn't it, 8%? But when you consider that the southern fraction of the reef, there was a 250% increase in less than a decade after a massive cyclone wiped out most of the coral, an 8% reduction is a very small amount, and it will grow back very quickly. There's a very famous paper that says that coal dust, of all things, is affecting the reef. But when you actually look at the data, there's a 3,000% error, or a factor of 30 error, and then another scientist exaggerated that by a further factor of 10 or another 1,000% in terms of the area that's affected, and they did that to a Senate inquiry. Pesticides are supposedly killing the reef, but actually they don't usually even bother to measure them on the Great Barrier Reef itself. They only actually look at them on the very close inshore corals, which is only 1% of the reef, and even there they're often undetectable and in very low concentrations. But on the reef itself, on the main Great Barrier Reef, in fact, the amount of corals, the amount of pesticides is so low that you can't detect it. Possibly my favourite is that supposedly pharmaceuticals from sewage is a medium risk to the Great Barrier Reef. So this is when you take a headache tablet, some of it passes through your body, goes to the sewage treatment plant, then it somehow gets out 20, 30, 100 kilometres out to the Great Barrier Reef and kills the coral. So when I've looked at a lot of these because I had a bit of spare time in the last year, and so what I managed to do was go to these reports and see how could it be that pharmaceuticals are killing the reef. And when you go to the reports, you don't actually find any data of the concentrations of, paracetamol on the reef. You don't even find the data from it close inshore. Virtually all the data is from the outlet pipe of the sewage treatment plant itself, all right? And it takes no account of the billions amount of dilution that would occur between there and the reef. And even there, by the way, the concentrations were very low. So examples of exaggerating and frankly trying to scare people with all these supposed threats to the reef. I'll mention this one because this is a famous example and is one of the ways that I ended up getting into trouble. This is a famous picture of a reef in 1883, well it's actually 1890s it should be, of a reef near Bowen before underwater photography, and it shows a picture of a reef sticking out of the water and supposedly the same place today. And the caption of these photographs in many reports was that this shows the massive damage effectively all along the coast from the sediment from farms. The only problem is if you go to that same location you can know roughly where you are by the islands in the background. You actually find that there's actually excellent coral in this vicinity, right? Now I actually mentioned this and I talked to a journalist about it and questioned whether the quality assurance methods that were used by the people making these claims were adequate, and I ended up getting into trouble for that. We'll come to that a little bit later. But if you do a sort of a general look at the coral cover versus time, since when records began properly, and by the way, The records are good from about 1990 onwards, right? Before that there's a bit of a question mark, but certainly from 19 they're good. For the northern region you see it going along and it's crashed, all right? That's the big bleaching event that occurred in 2016. But it's starting to come good, and my prediction is that within about 5 years it will be back to where it was. For the central region it's been fluctuating, but it's basically at about the same as what it always has been. The southern region, as I said, this data here I don't think is good, but anyway, if we look at it here, we come along, a big crash, this was Tropical Cyclone Hamish and Yasi came through, and then it's come good, all right? So basically about the same as it has been. And for the reef as a whole, there's about the same amount of coral now as there was when records began. So there's actually not a lot to worry about here. So that's a little bit of prima facie evidence that maybe there's a problem in science, in this Great Barrier Reef science. But actually the problem is far greater than that. There's a thing in science called the replication crisis, which not enough people have heard about. And you have to ask the question, who do you trust most, a used car salesman or a scientist? And as a scientist, I hate to say it, the answer is you don't trust a scientist over a used car salesman. We'll see why now. This is one of my heroes, actually, a fellow called John Ionides. He's a biomedical statistician, essentially a mathematician. And he basically blew the whistle on the replication crisis, where essentially he was finding that almost 50% of the papers have some form of fault in the biomedical area. And he published this incredibly famous paper, and this, by the way, is not controversial anywhere. This guy, unlike Peter Ridd, who's out of the establishment, this is an establishment person, right? People listen to him. He published this very famous paper called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. Right? Incredible. It's been cited over many thousands of times. And he also reckons that about 85% of our scientific resources are wasted due to false or exaggerated findings in the literature. Basically, we're working on stuff that is already false, a false premise. And as I say, he's establishment. Then this other very famous paper in the journal Science, where they were looking at what happens in the drug industry. So a pharmaceutical company will maybe take a bit of university research. So some university professor says, I've found this chemical and I think it cures cancer. So the first thing that a drug company will do is they will test that initial work, because it will cost them a couple of $2 billion to take that drug to market. So of course they test it. And what do they find when they test the original research? They find that the work is wrong about 80% of the time, right? And the rule of the thumb is that at least half of it is wrong. So this is a fairly shocking statistic, and it's right through science, unfortunately. So coming back to Richard Horton, the editor of the world's most famous journal, all right, a medical journal, the case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample size, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. So that's the biomedical area. It's in psychology, probably even worse, in pharmacy, it's in education. So the question then for me is, what about the Great Barrier Reef? Do we have decent systems of replication of checking the results that's more than peer review? But we've got another problem in the marine sciences. Is there a chance that some of the marine scientists are partially driven by ideology? All right, now there's not a lot of ideology in the drug industry, maybe a bit, but not a lot. But in the marine science industry, I think there is. And is there a chance that peer review amongst those scientists might be self-selecting of the dominant idea? And I think that is undoubtedly the case. And then, of course, there's the question, is there a robust debate without intimidation? So if somebody does challenge this, what will happen to you? As an example, what would happen to a scientist if he questioned the trustworthiness of the science institutions because they were only using peer review as their quality assurance mechanism, which of course is what I did? What would happen to a person? Well, we know what happens. What happened to me was that when I did that, I essentially said on a television program that the Australian Institute of Marine Science and the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies were producing untrustworthy work because it was only peer-reviewed, which meant that we had to presume that about half was wrong, and in my view that did not constitute trustworthy work. I ended up being hit with a couple of allegations of serious misconduct for doing that. The Institute of Public Affairs gave me a little bit, I'm just going to go through very brief what happened. A bit of legal assistance. I think the university was probably a bit surprised that we did that. They then decided to come down really hard, and they decided to read all my emails, and they came up with 23 further counts of serious misconduct. Most of them related to telling other people that I was in trouble. So they were saying, here are your allegations against you. I was almost certainly going to be fired. You're not allowed to talk to anybody about them. And because I mentioned these in emails and things, they hit me with 23 more. A couple were quite remarkable. We'll talk about them in a second. We then decided to file in court. JCU gave me what they called a final censure, but they told me that I wasn't allowed to talk to any about it, about what had happened. And they also gave me instructions of what I was, and more importantly, was not allowed to say in public lectures like this to various institutions like the Sydney Institute, the IPA, and to another group. And I couldn't tolerate that. They were essentially saying that I wasn't allowed to talk about this trustworthiness issue. So we decided, no, we're not going to tolerate that. We knew that this was going to certainly end up happening what did happen, which was going to get fired, but there was no point in staying at a university if I was going to be gagged. So we decided to start a GoFundMe campaign to pay for the legal costs. That was very successful. Unfortunately, if you're going to do a GoFundMe campaign to ask for, at that stage, $100,000, you can't say, look, I've got, by this stage, 25 counts of serious misconduct, please give me $100,000. You've got to say what it's about. After all, I was a university lecturer, and people will assume all of those sorts of things that they might assume of a university lecturer who's up for 25 counts of serious misconduct. Right? That's a very scary allegation when those things are made against you. But of course they weren't, and we put all of those misconduct allegations against me, which were just about what I'd said, and of course JCU got very upset with that. But there was no choice, we had to do it. By the way, these secrecy provisions the judge ultimately ruled as unlawful. So because of that, JCU made a further dozen allegations against me based on the fact that I'd spoken about the issue. Some of my favourite allegations are as follows. There were so many, these are my favourite. When I emailed the allegations against me to my wife, just the actual formal copy, I wanted to make sure Cheryl actually had a copy on her system as well. They read my emails and said, you're not allowed to give this copy to your wife, you're breaking the confidentiality provision. Right? Unbelievable. A student who knew I was in trouble because it had leaked out wrote to me and said that she was disgusted by what the university was doing. I wrote back to her and actually said, look, JCU's no worse than any other university, which I truly believe, actually. They're no worse, right, but no better, unfortunately. I said they are Orwellian because they profess to want freedom of speech and academic freedom, but in fact they crush it. And of course they proved this by reading my emails and giving me an allegation against it. They obviously didn't have a sense of irony, or they hadn't read 1984, I'm not sure which. But I think these two are just ridiculous. This one is just unbelievable. I sent a copy of a newspaper article which was fairly unfavourable towards JCU, as almost all of them were, in fact, virtually without exception, to an old friend, an ex-PhD student who now works in France, with the byline, for amusement. And then everything in the email was about technical matters, because we work on robotics together. And because I said for your amusement with this attached article, JCU said I had disobeyed the no satire directive, We are not allowed to satire, parody or vilify the disciplinary process, and by saying, for your amusement, I had done that, okay? It was just ridiculous. Anyway, JCU lost on all counts, but essentially 28 more or less unlawful acts. The judge made all sorts of comments that JCU simply doesn't understand the concept of academic freedom. I think that the university has just gone on to reinforce that because they're going on to appeal, and essentially what they're going to be having to argue is that their code of conduct overrules academic freedom. So they're saying, if I see an organisation that's producing untrustworthy results, that I'm not allowed to say it. And that, unfortunately, by definition for me, is just not up to it.
How many years were you at James Cook University?
Well, I was actually an undergraduate. So I had a virtually unbroken career and studentship at JCU from 1978 to last year. There was only one calendar year when I wasn't there. The important point that I was making was that this untrustworthy work isn't just an academic, interest. It's actually being used to set legislation that's affecting every major industry in North Queensland. Every farm, every mine, the tourist industry is... we're telling the whole world that the Great Barrier Reef is in very poor condition. Is it surprised that tourists come to North Queensland and are then very surprised when they actually see brilliant coral? There's a whole lot of them who went somewhere else. So this is actually of great importance economically to the North Queensland region, and there we had the Vice-Chancellor of the only major university in the region saying we are not allowed to hear that from one of our people who's been working on the reef for well over 30 years and who's got actually a reasonable record as a scientist. It's just a disgraceful thing for a university to do.
Thank you very much, Professor Ridd, for that. A couple of questions. The first is that in one of the articles I've read, I believe originated from your desk, it's in regard to this funding of James Cook University and how the existing government could stop this whole action in a heartbeat.
Well, the Federal Education Minister, Dan Tehan, has instituted a review of universities to look at this whole problem of academic freedom. And they got ex-High Court Judge Robert French to write a report, and he said universities should not be allowed to crush academic freedom with their codes of conduct. The JCU Code of Conduct, I guarantee you that if I just looked at you like that in a sort of a glaring way, I've actually broken the Code of Conduct. That is bullying, right, and harassment. So, well, actually, it may not be bullying. It's probably not bullying, but it would certainly disobey something in the Code of Conduct. Now, this is effectively exactly what JCU has done. Right? They've invented their Code of Conduct, which would then, they're saying, trumps academic freedom. And the fact is that because almost anything can disobey the Code of Conduct, it gives them total right to crush whatever is said at the university. Now, Dan Tehan could, at a heartbeat, as you say, come along and say, no, we're going to implement the French review and this sort of thing is going to stop. We've also got to remember that the federal government supplies, most of the money for these universities, including James Cook University.
Yeah, no, I think that's most important, that the federal government, being a coalition government, is actively supporting your suppression of thought and intellectual freedom. I think that we really need to grasp that.
Yes.
Because I think it's a pivotal point.
It's a very important point. And there's another one that happened. I don't know whether you saw the news yesterday. There was a whistleblower at Murdoch University called Gerd, I've forgotten his second name, and he basically was saying that Murdoch, as with many universities, are accepting foreign students with almost no language ability, and they shouldn't be doing it. And he's now in serious trouble. The university is now not just trying to get rid of him, they're actually suing him. He could lose his house, he could lose everything. And so we have a government-funded institution suing this guy who blew the whistle on some practices which are frankly disgraceful, not just at Murdoch but at all universities. So it's happening all the time.
Yeah. And the other, in your slides, you mentioned an ideology-driven, if you like, science. In other words, it's not science at all, it's political.
Some of it becomes political. You see, what happens is that most marine biologists have wanted to be marine biologists since they were, knee-high to a grasshopper, right? I came into the marine science as by accident. I'm one of the few scientists up there who was actually a North Queenslander. I'm a physicist who ended up working on the reef. Most marine biologists are there because they love the reef. They've always wanted to be a marine biologist. And so that they are a bit emotionally attached to it. They then work with another bunch of marine biologists who are also emotionally attached. We have this peer selection going on. If you're not in the right group, you get flipped out. So you end up with this ideology building up. And so you're right, it's not proper science. It's not proper science unless the work is continuously and repeatedly checked, tested and replicated. And this is the fundamental problem that I've been going on all the time. It doesn't happen in that area of science, and it doesn't happen in a lot of areas of science, in fact.
There was a huge amount of money found its way up to your direction there by a fellow called Malcolm Turnbull. It started with 400, and you correct me whether it was thousands or millions, but it was money that was not requested. It just arrived. Can you tell us what it's got to do with this problem?
Well, the $440 million was dumped on the Great Barrier Reef Foundation to save the reef, and some of it will go to some reasonable schemes, but most of it, I think, will be wasted. But essentially, governments are actually... I have a great deal of sympathy for governments, even the ones that are doing the wrong thing, on this, because, you see, the whole world has been told that the reef is almost dead and it needs to be saved, right? The scientists have managed to convince the world of that, and that is the reality for a politician. So they know, well, we've got to be seen to be doing something, so, oh, well, here's $440 million, we're saving the reef, right? So the problem is not the government's doing the wrong thing. They have to do that because they know the people in the leafy suburbs, not the people up north, but certainly the people in the leafy suburbs in Adelaide, Melbourne and Sydney, know that the reef is in trouble, so they've got to be seen to be doing something. So in the end, the problem is a problem in the science organisations. The science organisations are producing this rubbish. They're not checking it. They have... I've had people in these big organisations complain that they've only got 2 or 3 media people, right? There's dozens, hundreds of media people in universities around Australia that feed stuff into the news, especially from these science organisations, and they've been able to convince the world that the reef is dead. So what we have to do, and this is why I'm working on this science quality, is get the science right so that we're feeding the right stuff into the media. People will suddenly start to realise actually the reef is in great condition, and then the governments can say, well, maybe we don't have to waste $440 million on that. We'll waste it on something else instead.
Would you say what happened at JCU and happens at a lot of universities is ideological process, or would you say it's social discourse?
How do you mean social discourse?
So in regards to like an echo chamber effect.
Universities have become extremely authoritarian in the last 20 years. So whereas professors, especially a group of professors, could get together and monster the Vice-Chancellor to do things, now the Vice-Chancellor can crush dissent. And it's the same everywhere. For some reason, the same sort of processes in all universities, virtually in the Western world, are occurring. Mainly, I think, because it's the same sort of person who ends up going into the universities. But it's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure what the answer is.
So would that be in regards to fears regarding funding, if it's mainly government funded, or is that in regards to how it's seen by the universities, or like what causes that?
Look, I think in my case that they just really were it wasn't a funding thing. There may have been a little bit there, but mostly they were just disgusted that somebody could challenge the idea that the reef is actually, it isn't in bad shape. There were hints of climate change denial there, and you can't have that. So I think it was more of an ideological thing, that I'd crossed the line ideologically. That was the main problem, actually, much more than any possible financial concern they may have had.
Okay. Now, if the climate is altering in some way, or it's not altering in some way, depending on prospect or what people think, where do you see the Barrier Reef being in 10 to 20 years' time, or even longer into the future?
Yeah, so with the Barrier Reef, of all the ecosystems in all the world, the Great Barrier Reef is the one that's going to breeze through 1 or 2 or 3 degree warming. It's not going to be a problem. I do worry a little bit about what they call the ocean pH problem. It's not quite acidification, but it's sort of like that. The carbon dioxide does change the ocean pH, and there is some evidence that could be an issue. But so far, if anything, the growth rates have increased. And this is exactly what you'd expect in a warming climate, irrespective of what's causing the warming. Remember that the climate was 1 to 2 degrees hotter in the Holocene climatic optimum 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And the reef probably was growing about 20% faster then.
Just wondering if you're taking a look at some of the, shall we say, instigating problems of issues with the replication and reliability.
Yeah.
Do you have any good ideas of what strategies could be put in place by governments or others to improve that? I mean, could governments be earmarking funding specifically for replication and other things like that?
That's precisely what we need to be doing. So what I've been proposing is an office for science quality assurance. The funny thing about science is that 95% of it you don't even have to worry if it's wrong, because it's never used, right? Most of the work that I've done will never be used, but some fraction of it will, and that's important. If it's going to be used for industry, industry can check it, and they do. If it's going to be used for government, the government should check it, and they don't. So this is where, for the reef, it's very simple. There's probably 20 main keystone scientific papers that need to be really gone over. I've gone over a few of them, and I found in every case that there's at least some problems. The National Party in Queensland, and I understand at the federal level, have got some sort of proposal, maybe not at the parliamentary level, but at the branch level, to have an office for science quality assurance. And it just is an obvious thing which we need, because it's not just Great Barrier Reef science. Murray-Darling, there is some shocking evidence that's being used to guide that policy. And of course there's the climate change thing as well. But it even goes to things like criminology and education. Do you believe the research that's coming out of a university? The answer is 50% of it is probably wrong. And you don't know which 50%. So, what state is that?
Sort of following on from that, I've also read some interesting material. I can't quote the author right now because I don't recall, because it was a little while ago, but on the use of questionable statistical measures in social sciences particularly. I'm just wondering whether there are academic strategies to ensure that robust and correct statistical measures are used when they're meant to be, and so forth.
Now, this is
peer review doesn't always pick that up when it's being peer reviewed by people within the same field. Quite often it seems to need an expert statistician.
And to be fair to the science, this is where the science establishment have actually been quite good. The science establishment recognise the replication crisis, and there's all sorts of things that are being done, and making, improving statistics and doing all those sorts of things. They're doing those sorts of things, which is great. And John Ioannidis was right at the beginning. But even Alan Finkel, the chief scientist, is talking about the replication crisis and what we've got to do. But the thing where they've got their head in the sands is what it means. What is the corollary of the fact that probably 50% of the peer-reviewed literature is wrong? Well, the corollary is that we have almost certainly used some of this stuff to set policy, and this is a disaster. Now, to be fair to the chief scientist, he probably doesn't want to get up, put his hand up and say, a lot of this stuff might be wrong. I guess he can't say that. But on the other hand, he should be supporting my call for an Office of Science Quality Assurance to at least start to check.
I'd first like to say thank you. It's lovely to hear a different perspective when it comes to science.
Yep.
My only question is, if the coral reef is doing well as you said it is, why is there such a decline in the certain marine life that use the reef as home?
I don't think there is a decline in the reef life. on the reef? Do you have a specific...
The clownfish is said to be dwindling in population.
I don't think you can rely on almost any of those, right? If there is, there's 3,000 reefs, they've all got coral on them, they've all got a lot of coral on them, they get wiped out occasionally, but they come back. Perhaps that one is right, I don't know. But on the main papers that I've looked at, essentially where they are predicting massive death, in fact you don't see it, the growth rates are about the same, the coral cover is about the same. I would have no confidence at all in a paper that said that the clownfish are decreasing. Now you could argue, well, how do I know that? Well, I don't. But given previous form, I just no longer have any confidence. But they could be.
I recently watched a video, and Lou sent it on to me. It was 5 years ago with Professor Plimer. The question I raise is, do you have people like him, some outstanding sort of independent characters with similar qualities, are they being supportive of you?
Well, there's other scientists who are certainly supporting. I've got my long-time collaborator, a guy called Piers Larkham, who's now outside. You know, this is fairly typical. The people who can publicly support are almost always outside the university system. So he's been the main one where we've written papers about this problem of replication in Great Barrier Reef. But of course people like Ian Plimer have been supporting me, literally Ian Plimer himself. And of course before that it was Bob Carter, so Bob Carter himself. I started in Bob Carter's lab in 1989. And of course Bob Carter worked on the reef for decades. That was where he cut his teeth, basically.
You mentioned one university student wrote you and you responded to that, and that got you into a bit of trouble.
Yeah.
Is there an increasing perception amongst university students as to what their lecturers and professors or head of departments are coming up with?
Don't give up on the young people, right? Really don't give up on them. My third-year physics class, they were in tears over what happened to me, right? They thought it was absolutely disgusting. The particular student in question there was utterly disgusted with what had gone on. I know that a lot of these students who would disagree with me on my view on the reef were disgusted by what was going on. I had a lab, and because we had a lot of room, I'd tell the second and third year students, come in, work in the lab, you know. And so I used to talk with them a lot, and they have not lost their brain, even though that they have been indoctrinated by this stage for 13, 14, 15 years. They are watching Jordan Peterson. They do know that there's indoctrination going on them, and I actually think that in the end, the young people will turn this around. My generation has actually made a complete hash of it, and it's their generation that ultimately will fix it up.
Well, of course, universities have a very persuasive way of bringing their academics to heel, because they're ordinary people, they've got wives, they've got families, they've got mortgages, like the rest of us. Yep. And so when your career is threatened, then you generally come up with the goods, whatever the goods require.
I think there's no doubt that I was prepared to walk closer to the cliff edge because I was closer to retirement than I would have been 10 years ago when the super wasn't quite so good as it is now. No, seriously, I mean, it's in the back of your mind. So, yeah, I've been fired, it's not been good, it's been very upsetting, but I'm going to be okay. Whereas if I was 40, I couldn't have done it, you know, I just couldn't have taken the risk, and this is one of the problems, that you've got people who'd like to take the risk, but they just can't.
To me, what's coming out with the frustration of the students and, if you like, the indoctrination of them through the universities, to me there's the potential, and you mentioned Jordan Peterson, there's a potential to actually move outside the existing structure or system and initiate your own university. Is that a thought? Is that a realistic thought?
I think it's inevitable. I think it's going to happen. That universities are no longer the place where new ideas are thought of. They're just machines that churn out, you know, trained people. If you're lucky, You know, they train engineers and they do a reasonable job. They train doctors and they do a reasonable job. They do something to these other people where I'm not sure what they do, but you know, but in terms of where ideas are coming from, and where people are getting their ideas from, it's from YouTube. It's not from the university.